I'm Mark Golub, and we will continue our focus on election 2016 from a Jewish perspective. A number of issues have surfaced. Many questions and some concerns have been expressed in response to the choices Bernie Sanders has made for those who represent his campaign on the Democratic Platform Committee. 3 of his choices are individuals with an actual antipathy for the State of Israel. One is James Zogby, the president of the Arab American Institute in Washington, who is a longtime pro-Palestinian activist. Another is a prominent African American, Cornel West, who has been an outspoken critic of Israeli policies on the West Bank and has actually come out publicly in support of the BDS movement. And a third is Democratic representative from the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, who happens to be America's first Muslim congressman. And Representative Ellison has also been a vocal critic of Israeli policy on the West Bank and in Gaza. And he says the United States needs to be more considerate of Palestinian needs. Now, it would seem that Senator Sanders, for all the hoopla and enthusiasm which he generates at rallies among young people and among voters of all ages, including Jewish voters, he's still not going to be the Democratic Party's nominee for president unless Hillary Clinton runs into problems with the FBI over her use of her private email server. Secretary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee facing off against Donald Trump in November's general election. But Bernie Sanders will still have input and influence in shaping the Democratic platform. And based on Sanders' picks of individuals with a strong anti-Israel bias, there's some real concern now for the direction in which the Democratic Party is heading in terms of its Middle East policy overall and its position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. Well, for some insight and analysis, I'm most pleased to welcome back to JBS the Washington correspondent for the Jewish Forward, Nathan Guttman. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on the show, Mark.
Okay, first, Nathan, what kind of rumblings have you heard from inside the Jewish community over Bernie Sanders' choices of James Zogby, Cornel West, and Congressman Keith Ellison for the Democratic Platform Committee?
Well, in general, I'd say that the organized Jewish community and the organized pro-Israel community haven't viewed positively the choices of Bernie Sanders in general when it comes to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this dates back to his comments on the use of Israeli force in Gaza, which he thought was excessive use, the claim that he made and then retracted of Israel killing 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And basically his comments of the need for America to adopt a more even-handed policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And all this came to a practical stand when Sanders was offered by the DNC to appoint 5 members of this 15-member committee that will shape the party's platform. And 3 of them are, as you mentioned, have strong views on Israel. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that all of them are anti-Israel. Definitely Cornel West, Professor West, has expressed very strong positions condemning Israel. Keith Ellison has been very active on Palestinian rights, but he also has a strong connection with the Jewish and the pro-Israel community, clearly from the more progressive side, but still he does have a constructive relationship going on there. And Jim Zogby, who has been around for many decades and has been active on these issues, is also considered a centrist. He's a pro-two-state solution activist. And a long-time operative of the Democratic Party. So I'd say that it's not so much of them being vehemently anti-Israeli, it's the fact that by the choice of three members out of his five that have expressed their willingness or their goal of changing the platform when it comes to Israel, it does show where Bernie Sanders' focus is when it comes to the platform decisions. And as you mentioned, since he won't be the candidate, the platform is where he can shape the party's future to a certain extent.
Are you saying, by the way, Nathan, that this is much to do about nothing?
Well, first of all, we should ask ourselves, how important is the platform? The platform is important right now, and it will be debated in the convention in July. And pretty much then it's put on the shelf and no one remembers it.
Right.
Because basically, while they're discussing the platform, we had Hillary Clinton give a major foreign policy speech yesterday. She didn't wait for the party platform to elaborate her positions. She was very strongly pro-Israel in that speech. So it doesn't have a lot of practical sense. It also is pretty clear by the makeup of the committee that even though Bernie Sanders does have his people who have strong views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the committee, they don't have a majority. So it is unlikely to happen. However, what they could do is drag the Democratic Party at its convention in Philadelphia at the end of July to this public debate over Israel. Should they be more even-handed? Should they lean more towards the Palestinian side and less towards the Israeli side? And that's something that Democrats feel could damage them and damage their standing with the pro-Israel community.
Very interesting. You know, we discussed this the last time we had a conversation, Nathan, the extent to which the Jewish community has traditionally been Democratic. It tends to vote upwards of 70%, sometimes more, in favor of the Democratic nominee. And yet there is a fear in the Jewish community that in some way the Democratic Party has been hijacked by the far left, that Bernie Sanders' unexpected popularity has forced Hillary Clinton to move to the left. And many Jews remember the way in which those on the floor of the last Democratic convention booed when the platform committee decided to insert or reinsert the Jerusalem plank, which President Obama said was omitted wholly by accident. And then Democratic members of the House and Senate boycotted Prime Minister Netanyahu's address to a joint session of Congress when he came to voice his objections to the Obama nuclear deal. And suddenly, what has always been seen as a terrific bipartisan support for Israel, people feel, Nathan, it is in some way in jeopardy, and that many American Jews committed to the state of Israel and who see themselves as Democrats, been lifelong Democrats, they're now worrying that the far left will turn the Democratic platform and more, the Democratic perspective, the Democratic Party, against the state of Israel. Now, you're in Washington every day. What's your sense of this fear?
Well, I think this fear or this concern has to do with this great divide within the Democratic Party. Because really, when you talk to people in Washington, or even better, just look at the voting record of Democrats in Congress, look at all the Democratic elected officials. Pretty much you see unanimity when it comes to Israel. They're staunchly pro-Israel when it comes to foreign aid to Israel, when it comes to supporting Israel, when it comes to backing Israel in international forums, to helping Israel militarily. There is no doubt that Democratic elected officials are 100% pro-Israel, with the few exceptions. However, on the grassroots level, we are seeing a certain change. And we saw even in the latest Pew survey that younger Democrats seem to be less sympathetic to Israel, while older generation Democrats are with a great majority, sympathize with a great majority more to the Israeli side, than with the Palestinian side. It's not the case with younger Democrats. And if this trend continues, basically these people will grow up through the ranks, and eventually one day they'll be the people representing the Democratic Party in Washington, and they may be able to change the policy. And that's basically the concern, the long-term concern that there is this alienation between Israel and younger Democrats, and eventually that will trickle up to the decision-making levels.
Very interesting. By the way, you know, any poll is a snapshot, Nathan, of what's happening at a given moment in time. All of these young Americans are going to grow up and be older Americans one day. And I always wonder whether the older Americans who are now so pro-Israel, had they been polled when they were young, would they have been as sensitive to and as caring for the state of Israel as they are now? One of the things I wonder is, as people grow and they ultimately have a family and they have concerns that give them more sense of the real world, will they in some way become more realistic about what the state of Israel can and cannot do? Or will they remain with this leftist bent that you're now expressing? Do you have any feeling about that?
Well, I think it's pretty much established that everyone is radical when she or he are in college, and it kind of wears off as they grow up and start a family. And it's true in all walks of life, not only when it comes to foreign policy or to U.S.-Israel relations.
Exactly.
So this does exist. However, there is also another trend going on, and that is this growing distancing between Israel and younger Jewish Americans. That has to do not so much with a radicalized approach or critical approach towards Israel, but with the fact, and this is also backed by polls, that younger Jewish Americans view Israel now as something complicated, as something conflicted, as something that doesn't necessarily always fit their values, and therefore they don't adopt an anti-Israel position. Rather, they distance themselves from the whole issue. They take up other causes, and that could be a danger, again, a decade or two from now.
Okay. By the way, speak to me for one moment about, I mean, you touched on it, but I want you to elaborate. Setting Bernie Sanders aside, you and I do not expect him to be the Democratic nominee. So we'll have, it looks like, Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump. If I were to speak to Israelis, in Tel Aviv, in Netanya, and in Jerusalem, what is their perception of where Clinton and Trump stand on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and U.S. support, and not only support, Nathan, but sort of loyalty to the state of Israel?
Right. I think we've seen a few surveys done in Israel. I don't know how representative they are, but basically the general sentiment is that on the one hand, Hillary Clinton is more reliable. You know what you're going to get, and she will be a staunch ally of Israel and a reliable friend. On the other hand, that Donald Trump would probably get along better with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and will be more pro-Israel in the sense of supporting Israeli policies. But again, these polls and these surveys reflect very little involvement of Israelis in this election cycle. Yes, they follow it very closely, but they don't necessarily look at the broader question of what this means for America and what this means for bigger questions that have to do with American society and economy and so forth. So, but in general, it kind of falls in line with the images of both candidates. Donald Trump is a strong guy, so he will communicate better with Bibi Netanyahu, who tends to project that image of the strong guy. And Hillary Clinton is the more reliable, responsible adult, and therefore should be able to help Israel in that sense. I don't think there are strong views either way.
Mm-hmm. What we hear is that the Israeli public was not enamored with President Obama. Obviously, those who are opposing Hillary Clinton in the United States are arguing a President Clinton election will mean a third term of President Obama. Do Israelis worry that the kind of distancing, this daylight that President Obama wanted to create between the United States and Israel, is a daylight that Hillary Clinton will want to pursue as well?
I think that sentiment definitely exists, Mark. I think that's something that Israelis have in mind because they fed that in these 7 or 8 years with President Obama were characterized by friction between him and Prime Minister Netanyahu, even though I think Israelis do differentiate between the personal relationship between the two leaders and the general support that the U.S. under Obama gave Israel. But still, there is a sense that a continuation of the same policy will mean the same sources of tension between the two countries when it comes to settlements, when it comes to peace process with the Palestinians, and so on. However, there's an interesting point that people tend to ignore. Yes, Israelis widely, or at least Israelis that support the government, don't really like President Obama. But Israelis in general loved President Bill Clinton. He was a very popular figure in Israel during his presidency and afterwards. So that, in a sense, also can reflect on this question.
Yes, very good point. Okay, Nathan, talk to me about another issue sort of related. It certainly has to do with the state of Israel. In Israel today, a trial of Sergeant Elor Azaria is in progress in Haifa. Sergeant Azaria is being charged with manslaughter for shooting what turned out to be an unarmed Palestinian in Hebron, whom the sergeant thought was wearing an explosive vest. That's what his claim is. The charge against him is that he shot a suspect dead in the head when the suspect was already in total custody and was not posing any threat to civilians or any soldiers in the area. Now, on his Sunday television hour on CNN, Fareed Zakaria suggested that the recent shakeup of the Israeli government, in which Avigdor Liberman brought his Yisrael Beitenu party 6 seats into the Netanyahu coalition, for which Mr. Lieberman demanded and was given the position of defense minister, replacing former IDF chief of staff, Bogi Ya'alon, that this shakeup demonstrates a right-wing shift in general of the Israeli government, and that it was motivated by the right-wing support of Sergeant Azaria in opposition to General Ya'alon's denunciation of the sergeant. My question for you, Nathan, on a scale of 1 to 10, to what degree was the shakeup of the coalition government and Lieberman's replacing Ya'alon influenced by the Azaria trial?
I'd say it's a solid 5 there, at least, because sure, Netanyahu wanted, and that was his main motivation. First of all, he wanted to expand his coalition. He was based on a coalition of 61 members, which is the bare minimum he needs in order to survive in the Israeli coalition system. And he sought to expand it, and it makes political sense to expand your coalition because you don't want to be dependent on one member of Knesset who might leave, and then you lose your government in the way Israeli politics works. So clearly Netanyahu had the motivation of expanding his coalition all the time. However, the fact that Ya'alon was seen as very critical, of course, of Sergeant Azaria, as the voice of the IDF, as the voice of what people seem to see this need for justice and morality in the IDF that they feel is fading away. All these issues basically alienated Ya'alon, who was holding a very senior position as defense minister. All these issues alienated him from the broader Likud and right-wing public. And there were protests against him, and there were people within the party that wanted him out. And therefore, it was a good opportunity for Netanyahu both to expand his coalition and to do it to the right while kicking out Ya'alon and replacing him with Lieberman in a sense that also satisfies his own right-wing base in the party and in the broader right wing in Israel.
Okay, but I want you to separate the two issues. And again, this in some way is not fair. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Chaviv Retegur, correspondent on the Times of Israel. We spoke to him about this, and he felt that the trial of Azaria had very little to do with all of the shakeup, and that, as you just described, the shakeup was really a function of Netanyahu's needing to bolster a most fragile coalition in which individual Knesset members were constantly threatening him to quit, and which was making the passage of the annual Israeli budget, which is critical to every Israeli government, it was getting in the way or threatening the ability to shape the budget, and that as a result, what motivated Netanyahu was really a need to build a larger coalition, if at the same time, as a corollary, but as a minor corollary, Lieberman, who was demanding that he get the defense minister position because of the friction that had been created when Ya'alon came out so strongly for Sergeant Ozaria, it gave Netanyahu a little bit of wiggle room, but it wasn't the driving force that propelled Netanyahu first to meet with Herzog and then to accept basically Lieberman saying, wait a minute, okay, I'll join. And ultimately, he brought his 6 seats and it has helped Netanyahu. Now, that's the scenario, it seems, really drove events, and that, again, I don't want to lead you. If you think I'm wrong, you must tell me. But when I watch a Zakaria describe a situation in which he never once mentions the political problems that have been plaguing Netanyahu, and describe this on American television as Netanyahu's buckling to or embracing or trying to simply move further to the right. And that's why he brings Lieberman into the coalition, and that's why Lieberman replaces Ya'alon. It seems to me, and you'll now tell me if you agree or disagree, to be a misreading of the Israeli scene, and worse than that, if it is a misreading of the Israeli scene, it misleads the American public watching CNN. Okay, so I want you to sort of respond to that whole thing.
Sure. I mean, I'd say that I don't think it's all that misleading. I think it's just seeing part of the picture and not all of it. Clearly, the main motivation of Netanyahu was to expand his coalition. It makes political sense, and that's what he wanted to do. However, he did have a few choices when he came to do that. First of all, he could expand the coalition to the center and bring in Bougie Herzog and the Labour Party. He was in talks with them, and these talks were, according to people that were reporting on them, were basically going well. They reached some agreements, and clearly he could have chosen to expand to the center and not to the right. Once he decided to expand to the right, first of all, he could have backed his defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, and told Avigdor Liberman, listen, we'd love to have you in our cabinet, but the defense minister position is taken right now. We're not offering that. You can have all these other positions. And let's keep in mind that Netanyahu is still holding the foreign ministry for himself and many other portfolios. So there were other ways of getting Lieberman into the government. And even if he decided to or if he had no choice but to give him the defense ministry, he could still do it in a way that would keep Moshe Ya'alon satisfied and respected. Basically, Ya'alon was kicked out by Netanyahu. He was told that he's out of office. He wasn't really offered a good other position in the cabinet. So I think that even though I agree with you, there was the basic motivation was political, not ideological, the way that it was done indicates that there was some kind of an ideological element to it, some kind of element here that also came to say, listen, we don't support, or my government won't give the backing to a minister who chooses to side with the military justice system or with the criticism of a soldier who shot a Palestinian under these circumstances.
Okay, I just want to push you a little bit further, and my own goal, Nathan, only is to give the JBS audience, through any program we do, as much of the accurate information as possible. And by the way, maybe it's never black and white or left and right, and maybe it's never clear for sure what the truth is. But what I understood was that for Herzog to join the coalition, and for Herzog to appease his own left membership in his Zion party, he would have to get concessions from Netanyahu on the peace process, which simply weren't realistic at this point in time. And that while Herzog and Netanyahu might have in some ideal way been happy to create a unity government, it wasn't possible for either man to do that at the present time. So the suggestion you make that, gee, why didn't Netanyahu keep working with Herzog? What I have been told and what we seem to read and understand is that really was not a viable option, and that Netanyahu almost had no choice but to go with Liberman. Once he accepts Liberman into the coalition, you are correct, I believe, he could have insisted, for example, that Liberman take the foreign minister position and keep Ya'alon. What Lieberman was saying is, I will not join unless I have the defense ministry portfolio. And we also read that Netanyahu might be ready to give Ya'alon the foreign ministership, but Ya'alon immediately said, I don't want to be part of the government at all. I don't want to be in politics anymore. I'm done. I'm gone. That's a different slant on the story than you just gave, and I want to hear what you respond to that slant.
Well, I'd say regarding the Zionist Union, what used to be the Labor, led by Bougie Herzog, they had serious discussions going on. They had a serious negotiation between the two of them. And it seems that the differences, even though they sound as if they were big, weren't in practical terms very big. Basically, what Herzog wanted was some kind of a promise for a kind of a horizon, a political horizon in terms of advancing the two-state solution, in terms of renewing negotiations with the Palestinians and limiting to a certain extent building in the West Bank. These are pretty much basic things that the Netanyahu government could decide that it agrees to or not, but it's not an unsurmountable obstacle that he couldn't overcome, especially when he had all this international backing. And let's keep in mind that the Egyptian president, Sisi, came out with a comment saying that basically he wants to see Netanyahu expand his coalition with the Labour Party. And that could give Netanyahu a lot of backing within his party, saying, listen, I'm adding here a centrist party, but gaining international recognition. He had Tony Blair supporting this idea. He didn't have to do much. He had to basically agree to be open to negotiations, which is what he says he does anyways. Now, clearly, there are political obstacles. Netanyahu, even though we consider him over here as a hardliner to a certain extent or as a right-winger, he's basically one of the moderates in his own party and in his own coalition. Yes. So even though Netanyahu could probably agree to Herzog's demands, it would be a hard sell within the party.
Excellently done. By the way, Nathan, I told you before we went on the air, this is the second time you've been with us. You are a real fan favorite right away. I hear a dog in the background. What kind of dog, Nathan?
Well, it's an English Springer Spaniel, and he's getting anxious because the door is closed.
Okay. And but wait,
sorry about that.
I see all these books behind you. Are you in your library?
I'm in my home office / library. Yes.
Well, it is always wonderful to talk to you. We're going to continue to call you. I appreciate the nuance you try to bring to the discussion, and it's always wonderful you give us time. You be well. Kol tuva hatzlacha. We'll talk again very soon.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Be well.
Thanks.
The thoughts of Nathan Guttman, Washington correspondent of the Jewish Forward. And again, it's interesting to hear him place a much more moderate perspective on even the appointment of three individuals who seem to be anti-Israel. And he cautions us it's not as anti-Israel as it might look. We'll see how the Democratic platform moves on. And I think he's absolutely right. Platforms mean very, very little in terms of elections and what happens after elections are over. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, editor of JBS, Dennis Golan, the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.